A month or two ago, I saw a video by Randy Ray, the literate Texan, about he was starting something called the Ray Bradbury Challenge, which he described as you're supposed to read a poem, a short story, and an essay every single day. And he said, and it's supposed to make you more creative, which is not a problem for me, but I still thought that seemed like a neat thing to do. I had already been trying to read more essays and have been doing that. Poetry is something I have struggled with trying to get into outside certain narrow range, but I keep working on that. And I like science fiction short stories, but even fantasy short stories I really don't read, much less any non-genre fiction, aside from obviously like, Sherlock Holmes stories, right? And so I did that, and I was like, Ray Bradbury Challenge, you're supposed to do this for 1,000 days, or 1,001 days maybe. No, 1,000 days, and I was like, well, if you're going 1,000, you might as well go 1,001 and do the Arabian Nights thing, right? But anyways, like, yeah, there's no way I'm doing 1,000 days, but maybe I'll manage like a month. And then I got horribly sick, and I couldn't really read much of anything. And I was like, well, that doesn't really count, and I tried to continue it after that. I've been doing it for 2 weeks at this point. But the magic was sort of broken for me, right? It isn't quite the same if you're doing it with an asterisk, even for a month. And I think I might try to do it again at some point, but once this other attempt is not so fresh in my mind, and it feels like a fresh attempt and not an attempt to make up for having not even made it a month on the Ray Bradbury Challenge. But I'm still glad I did it, because it got me reading a number of things I wouldn't have. And so in terms of essays, like I'd already been reading a lot, but one thing I started thinking about is Arthur Koestler, who I've mentioned. I reference his books behind me, Ghost in the Machine and Act of Creation, which is not behind me, a lot. But I haven't read his essays, and other people reference his fiction, like Darkness at Noon, which I still haven't read. But he also wrote a collection of essays, most notably this one, The Yogi and the Commissar. And so I read the titular essay in this book. I haven't read any of the other essays in this book yet, because I read the first essay right in that attempt to get back in the habit, which didn't last even a week. But it was interesting. He was basically arguing you have a spectrum of humanity between the highly detail-oriented, the Commissar, and the highly big-picture, sort of holistic Yogi. And everything people do is a trade-off between the two, and none of them really provides the answer, which I've talked about the idea of Seneca's barbell from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, where you're taking the extremes. I think the best solution is to try to combine extreme yogi and extreme commissar tendencies where they're appropriate, but not really the point. The point is I want to talk about like what I read as a result of the Ray Bradbury Challenge. And so, again, wasn't reading a lot of essays that I otherwise might not have, but I was reading short stories that I wouldn't have. And initially, after I read one story by Flannery O'Connor, and then I wasn't impressed with that story. And that's the thing, is I generally don't like literary fiction short stories very much. And so then I was like, well, I don't read fantasy short stories. I read science fiction short stories. I read fairy tales, but I don't read fantasy short stories. And I had this book for a while because I liked their big book of science fiction. And so I read several of the stories in here. And then I have this book from my father, The Complete Works of Saki, so I started reading some of the Reginald stories, which I liked better than I expected. I had read P.G. Wodehouse's Worcester and Jeeves stories, and initially I didn't like them, but they've kind of grown on me. And Reginald is kind of a similar dynamic. It's basically sort of social dynamics of spoiled rich kids, but it's still entertaining. And then I read some of his other non-Reginald stories in here. And then for the poems, so I have these Dover collections of poems that I read. None of them terribly impressed me. But I realized, so Bertolt Brecht, I think I referenced him in something maybe it was just a conversation. I'm like, oh, I wonder if he wrote poems, because I've noticed a lot of people from that time period were what was called men of letters, and so they would write a lot of things. And indeed, he did write poems. And I read a few of these, and I really liked them. And generally, when I was doing this challenge, I was typically actually reading like 2 poems, unless they were really long poems, because poems are short. And so I read, I think, half a dozen of the poems in here and really liked a couple of them. And I have my the Readings channel. I will probably read 1 or 2 of these poems on there at some point. And likewise, my father had this collection, and I was reading several of the poems in it. And the one that I really liked in here was John Dryden's poem about Alexander the Great. So I was like, I want to read more John Dryden. And so I ordered this Penguin Classics collection of Dryden's poems, and the Alexander poem isn't in here. And none of the other poems make the same impression. I'm not sure when they selected these poems why they didn't do the Alexander poem, because that was the one that made an impression. But anyways, so yeah, I just wanted to talk about this quickly. Yeah, I failed the Ray Bradbury Challenge on my first attempt, even with the much reduced goal of doing it for a month. I'll probably do it again at some point. But it was useful because it got me reading things that I wouldn't necessarily be reading otherwise. The other thing about it is I learned from Allison Talks Books that you're actually supposed to also write a short story every week when you're doing this, which I am not going to do for now. I was thinking maybe I would do a poem for it, but I started it just because it was like, it seems fun to try to do this. And the way I was doing the challenge, I was thinking of it, only stuff I read at the night shortly before I was going to bed counted. And so if I was reading essays in the day, that didn't count. It had to be an essay I read all together at night before I went to bed. And so, yeah, glad I did that, even though I didn't even last a month. I'll probably try to do it again, and I feel good talking about it because Randy Ray recently hit 20,000 subscribers, has been answering viewer question and answers, which I submitted one that looks like he's saving the best for last, so that'll be in the 4th video on that, hopefully. But anyways, he was answering someone else's question, are you still doing the Ray Bradbury challenge? And he was like, no, I stopped on that. So I'm like, okay, if Randy didn't even make it, he probably made it longer than I did, but he certainly didn't make it longer than a couple months. I don't need to feel too bad about it. Someone with ADHD not making it more than 2 weeks, especially in terms of sickness, but I do want to try it again sometime. So thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.